this weekend, the latest film in the Conjuring universe, The Nun II, drops in theaters. So today, I'm doing a Conjuring universe tier ranking. If you want to create your own Conjuring Universe tier ranking, I have a link down below in the description. Go to that link, fill out your own one, and if you do a screenshot and post it on Instagram and Twitter and tag me, I will share some of your tier rankings. With that said, let's get started right at the beginning with The Conjuring. Now, if you just read a plot synopsis for this movie, it sounds like 1,000 other haunted house movies, but no reason to beat around the bush here. This movie goes in the S tier. It takes a fairly familiar setup and just elevates it through execution on every single front. From the way that it just perfectly captures this 70s aesthetic with the production design, the haircuts, the way people talk, the technology that they're using, the soundtrack that is playing, everything transports you back in time to a time and a place. Another important detail here is the characters and performances are all great, where you have characters that feel like real people. Now, it helps that they're based off real people, and so there's something grounding it. But like our Warrens, while they are people with super interesting jobs, they're super normal at the exact same time. And they're skeptics themselves. They don't believe everyone that comes to them, and it just makes them feel so much more real and believable because they're grounded in normal life. It feels so much like our own existence, just set 50 years in the past. You can buy into the other stuff that takes place. But even like small characters, the little children in this movie, so many of them have gone on to have full careers over the last decade. Final thing you got to talk about here, there's just so many great practical effects. James Wan does so much of the work in camera, so it just feels so much more visceral, terrifying as you're seeing a person actually being dragged around, thrown around. And so a movie that takes you to a time and a place that feels believable. Therefore, it's so much more terrifying. It started on the top, and James Wan is a master of horror. Then we have Annabelle. One of the things that really stood out about the first Conjuring movie was the Annabelle doll, whether the cold open or the way that she ties back into the film. Later on, everyone left that film talking about Annabelle, and they picked up on that and quickly turned around an Annabelle spinoff. And whereas The Conjuring was this movie that took a fairly familiar premise and just elevated everything, Annabelle is just as generic and dull as its premise. It goes in the boring category. I don't think that it's wildly incompetent. It makes sense. They brought in actors that can pull off performances, but you don't remember any of the characters. You don't remember any of the set pieces. Just nothing distinct here. Just a creepy doll tormenting a family and just a lot of walking around the house, and nothing particularly interesting happens. Other important contrast here with this movie, James Wan has been a master of horror for 20 years and has multiple standout great horror movies and franchises, and then he's gone on to direct billion-dollar films. This is a top-tier director of the last 20 years. The guy that they picked to do Annabelle is the guy that directed Mortal Kombat Annihilation, one of the worst movies ever made. And then between that and directing Annabelle, he did a movie that has a 0% on Rotten Tomatoes, another one that has like 13%. They went from James Wan, master of horror, to the director of Mortal Kombat Annihilation. And I think you just see that in the film that you're watching. He's just not as good of a director. And so therefore nothing kind of has that spark or life to it. Moving right along, The Conjuring 2. James Wan returns to give us another Conjuring film, and it's another great one. It also goes in the S tier. Now, with this movie, because the first one was such a big hit, it has a bigger budget, and you see that in the film, where all of James Wan's crazy, wild horror ideas, visualizations, he's able to actually attempt all this stuff. And so by this point in time, he's a well-established director that has over 10 years of films under his belt. And this feels like a more mature film on an emotional level, with the visuals, with the subplots, with the ideas being explored. It just expands on everything. I think to some extent that might make the movie a little bit less effective for me, in a sense that there's maybe a little bit too much kind of going on here, but each individual thing is done really well. I love the idea that they kind of work in the public reputation of the Warrens into the story, and the way that the news media would kind of follow up on a story like this. And so you kind of add a bunch of these subplots that kind of make it interesting. We get to know more about the background, how the Warrens met each other, that just makes it a little bit more personal. And they just feel like such charming, normal people doing very interesting things. And then even like rewatching it a week back or so, while the movie's very dark, disturbing in what's happening, it always pauses to find a hopeful note of where a wife is worried about her husband and what's going to happen to him. Like, it all, like, he pushes back and is like, but God wouldn't have revealed that to you if he didn't want it to happen. And there's always this hopeful note, even in this very dark film where bad things happen, there's evil forces, finds a way to be hopeful. And so a great companion to the first film, another fantastic horror movie that maybe, matter of preference, I think I prefer the first Conjuring for its simplicity, but I love that this one kind of goes more complex in its own right, but maybe that's just a matter of taste. James Wan did it again. That'll bring us to our second spin-off, Annabelle Creation, and this was a big improvement over the first Annabelle, and this should have been the movie that they made after The Conjuring, as this is a solid prequel spin-off giving the backstory of where this doll came from while telling an interesting story in its own right. Nice little detail here. It is kind of set at this home that's in this isolated location, far enough in the past to where it feels very remote and dangerous where they're at. It's also this crickety old house, and therefore there's some real nice uses of sound all throughout the entire movie. They give, one of our girls polio, and so that limits her movement, which in a scary movie where there's evil things chasing you around, it's a nice little conflict. There's plenty of scary images in here. As the one that always stands out to me is the one where the father is holding the cross and his fingers just keep being bent backwards. I mean, it's just so nasty, but such a powerful image at the same time. And it does a good job of kind of doing this slow burn where bad's coming and it slowly builds and crescendos in the third act. Now, I don't think that this one is quite great or S tier, but it's definitely good. I think maybe it's a little bit too dry in the way that it plays out, that whether that needed to be a little bit faster, a little bit, I don't know, maybe, I don't want to like go comedy here, but it's a little more humor to just kind of break the monotony, something that kind of spices it up a little bit. Like one of the things you notice in the mainline Conjuring movies is the soundtrack and like these rock songs and classic rock songs kicking in. And with this movie, you just kind of don't have any of that. You don't have kind of the charming Warrens that kind of add a little bit of levity into a tense film. And so I think adding something like that into the mix would have pushed it up to that next tier. But overall, massive improvement over the first one. Next up, The Nun. Coming out of the first Conjuring, people wanted to know more about Annabelle. Coming out of the second Conjuring, people wanted to know more about The Nun. Thus, The Nun got her own spin-off. And I find this movie to be very boring. It's a film that on paper has some interesting ideas. It goes off to this remote location, which should be interesting. It ties in these ideas of Catholic relics, which I like that type of mythology. Anytime they start talking about relics with powers, I go, oh, that's kind of fun and interesting. There's some backstory in here about way back in the past where some of this came from. They tie it into World War II. All that stuff I actually really like. The story we're telling and the way it plays out is just so dull and dry. Once again, kind of like Annabelle Creation, there's just not really any humor, music, anything that kind of breaks the monotony. But even more so, you're in a location with only really 3 characters. And so the whole movie is just them walking through dark corridors with lanterns, and then a jump scare happens. And then they pause, exposition dump, and then they walk outside with a lantern. Jump scare, exposition dump. And that's the whole movie. It's just so dull and bland. And it's a bad sign when your exposition dumps are the most interesting thing about your movie. Also, The casting of Vera Farmiga's sister as the lead in this movie is one of the most baffling choices I have ever seen in a franchise, because they cast a sister as a different role in the franchise, but her sister just looks like a younger version of her, and it's a movie set 20 years before The Conjuring, so it feels like, are we watching a young Lorraine Warren? Is that what we're watching? Nope. That's not where this is headed. They just made the very weird choice to cast her lookalike sister in the lead in this film, which I'm just so baffled as to why they would do that. That'll bring us to the unofficial Conjuring universe film, The Curse of La Llorona, a movie that features the Annabelle Doll, a character from Annabelle, but the producers have kind of played coy as to whether it's actually in the Conjuring franchise or not, despite clearly being in the Conjuring universe. Anyway, as for the movie itself, it's an okay haunted house movie that is very distinctly super generic. They cast Linda Cardellini in the lead role. She's a very fun actress, has been great in things. She's just nothing to do here. There's nothing really to be interesting with this role. It's just scared mother. That's her whole part in the film. And the movie has the appropriate jump scares, builds the appropriate tension. It does all the things it's supposed to do, but we've seen it many, many, many times before. Now, the reason this one kind of gets bumped up out of boring into generic is that it does get better in the final 40%, where they bring in Raymond Cruz as Tuco from Breaking Bad as kind of the shaman that comes in to help them. I love his dry sense of humor in this movie.
Ta-da!
I don't know if he's just phoning it in or if this was intentional choices, but he has just this totally deadpan performance that I think makes this movie so much better that if he'd been in the whole film, it might have even gotten bumped up into the good category, because I find just the way that he does stuff, it adds just enough of that, a little humor, a little levity, breaks the monotony, and it stands out. It's memorable, where the other characters, even from Linda Cardellini, just not memorable. The characters in The Nun, as well as the first Annabelle, not memorable. Raymond Cruz, Tuco, he stands out.
Tight, yeah!
Real quick before I talk about the final three, remember, you can create your own tier ranking at the link down below in the description. And if you do a screenshot of it and share it on Twitter or on Instagram and tag me, I will share some of your tier rankings. Also, I've done a ton of past horror rankings. All the big gigantic franchises, Evil Dead, Insidious, Exorcist, Saw, all of them. I've done them before. You can check them out right up here. Whatever horror franchise you like, I've talked about it before. Moving right along, we're closing out our Annabelle trilogy with Annabelle Comes Home, and I'll put this one in the good category. I don't know if this is the best way to describe a horror film, but it's probably the lightest film in this franchise. And for that reason, I think it's kind of the most easily digestible. That you have the Warrens in there. It's set at their house that has all these fun relics in it. It's dealing with a lot of younger characters. It has probably the most kind of humor in it, like Bob's Got Balls.
Bob's got balls.
Just stuff that kind of makes it a little bit more consumable, a little bit more superficially entertaining. And that's kind of what I like about it. It's not trying to be in the top tier and compete with the main line Conjuring films, but it borrows the Warrens from them to make it a little bit more accessible. It's not as bleak and remote as like the Nun films. And so it just kind of feels very watchable, easier to put on, easier to kind of get through. And I think that's a good thing. Also, some more great casting here. They got McKenna Grace as replacing an actress to play the lead Warren daughter in this film. I think she's a top working young actress under the age of 18 right now. And so just kind of elevates things just a little bit. So I don't know, I like this one quite a bit. Our next to last film, The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It. And I know a lot of people really didn't like this film. I thought it was good. I'll actually put it at the top of the good category. And I get it. If you compare this movie and its direction to the first two Conjuring films, huge dip in quality. But I don't think that's saying this movie's bad. It's just saying James Wan is that good at directing horror films. And when it comes to this specific direction they went with this film, I think that it was a nice change of pace. When you're making the 8th film in a franchise, the 3rd film in the very specific trilogy that they're working on, you have to find something new and different to bring into the mix. And so they kind of went for this courtroom investigation at angle with it. And also, most of these movies, the villain of the story is the demon that's possessing a house. And I think the idea of bringing in the counterbalance to the Warrens, if the Warrens are the people working for good, who are the people with access to this world with bad motives that are trying to bring evil into the world? So bringing human bad actors into the mix that are manipulating things and cursing people, I thought that was fresh, new, and different. Something to bring in that has a new kind of flavor to it from what we've seen in the previous films in the franchise. Now, as I said before, it's definitely not as good as the 2 directed by James Wan, and as a recurring theme in here, the quality of the director tends to have a lot to do with the quality of the film. And in the case here, they got the director of The Curse of La Llorona, a movie that is very generic to me. So here I felt like they were working with the better characters, some interesting ideas, but a director that's not quite as strong. And so it just doesn't have that visual flair that James Wan brings as much. The emotional moments don't hit quite as hard. There are some cool images in this film, but not the way that they're just, every image seems cool in a James Wan film. So it's good, not great, definitely drop in quality from the James Wan films, but I think this is definitely a solid one. And finally, The Nun II. And I would say that The Nun II improves on the first Nun on virtually every single level, but I still don't know that it's particularly good still, so I'll have it at the top of the generic category. Now, all throughout the film, I think they found some better ways to kind of visualize some of the kills. There are quite a few kills in this one. Almost kind of plays a little bit like a slasher in that sense. The way that it visualizes some of the creepiness with like some magazines turning, some things in here that are images that are pretty cool. And in that regard, it's from the same guy that directed Conjuring, Devil Made Me Do It, same director that did Curse of La Llorona. Feels like each movie he gets a little bit stronger as a director, a more visual flair to it. And even kind of in the color palette of this film, it's set in a more interesting location, and then he uses like some bright reds to some nice effect here. The thing where this movie struggles is that it's a mystery. It's built on intrigue of what's going on in an investigation, but both because we've seen the previous film and they told us things at the end of the last film, as well as because this movie just shows us things, the audience is always ahead of the investigation. There's no actual intrigue or pieces that we can be piecing together. We just know the answer to everything. Or it's just exposition. It's not really a twist or reveal. It's just exposition that we didn't have about a relic. So I think that holds it back from being fully effective. And if they'd had a story that was a little bit stronger, it might have been able to inch up into that good category. But the story as a whole didn't work. The individual scares, the crescendo at the end of the film where it ties some things together worked pretty well for me. So top of the generic category. There are much worse films in this franchise, but there's also quite a few significantly better films. So there is my completed Conjuring Universe tier ranking. You can create your own at the link down below in the description. If you fill it out, screen capture it, post it on Twitter and Instagram stories, I will share some of yours in my stories and on Twitter. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you want more horror rankings, check out that playlist right over there, and keep talking movies and TV too much. Bye-bye.